Hey you guys, today we're going to be talking about raised bed gardening. So if you're planning on growing in raised beds or you already are growing in raised beds, then I'm going to share with you 10 do's and don'ts from my experience that will help you in your raised bed garden journey. I've been growing in raised beds for over 10 years, and every year it seems like we're adding another one. I've learned a lot about what is good to do and what is not good to do to have the most success with my raised beds. I'm going to share 10 things with you today, but I have to say that number 6 and number 10 might be a little bit controversial, but I think that's okay because I think getting all the viewpoints you can will help you make a more informed decision on your garden. Let's get to it. Number 1, do consider your raised bed height. But that doesn't mean that there's a right height or a wrong height. It really just depends on what you want as a gardener, what you're trying to accomplish. I have raised beds that are as high as these, just under 30 inches or so, all the way down to, I think 8 inches is my shortest one, and everything in between. This Birdie's raised bed here is 15 inches, which I think is very ideal. I think I like this size the best, but it really depends on your own personal preference and what you're going to be growing in each of them. So let's look at some pros and cons of a taller raised bed compared to a shorter one. The biggest benefit to a taller raised bed like this one is it's much easier to work. You don't have to bend over and you can work at the soil very easily. You also, in most cases, don't have to worry about weeds coming up from the bottom because it's so tall. The only weeds I really ever have to deal with in this garden are ones where the seeds blow in from outside. So the weeding is definitely cut back with a bed this height. While we do have deer in the area, and I guess they could browse here if they wanted to, I don't normally have that problem. Specifically, we have more issues with rabbits, and I've never had a rabbit climb this high, so that's another benefit of having a taller raised bed, is usually if you deal with critters like that, they're not going to be able to get into a bed this high. There are some drawbacks to having a bed this height, though. The most obvious one is it takes a lot to fill the bed. Now, you can take some shortcuts, like I've shown in another video, to fill the bottom with other materials as they break down, but still, you're looking at a lot of soil. So that's still something to consider. Another thing to keep in mind is that with a bed this tall, you might want to reconsider growing really tall crops. For instance, a really tall tomato would be a little bit difficult to reach, or if you're going to grow a vining crop, or even okra would work. I mean, it would grow well, but would I be able to reach that tall? For that reason, for this type of bed, I usually stick with crops that I'm able to reach to harvest. With a shorter raised bed, you have pros and cons as well. I think this is my shortest one, 6-8 inches or so. And as you can see, it's going to be a little bit harder to work. You have to bend over, still better than in the ground, but you do have further to go to work. You also have weeds that are going to be coming up from the ground soil if you have your bed in contact with the ground, and that can be a little bit of a nuisance, especially if you have aggressive weeds like Bermuda grass like we do. And obviously, rabbits can get into these beds very easily if you don't have your garden fenced off. But there's definitely benefits to a smaller raised bed. Obviously, you don't have to buy as much soil if you choose a smaller raised bed like this. Also, I love that a smaller bed is going to have contact with the soil. I don't have any landscape fabric or anything that is going to inhibit the roots of these crops going into the ground soil. And often there are lots of nutrients and minerals in that ground soil. If you have a garden like mine that the soil naturally doesn't drain very well, just getting the bed up a little bit will help with that. So you have the good topsoil in the top mixed with compost, but then you also have the soil underneath that the roots can reach down in. Not to mention microbial activity going on between the ground soil and your better soil, earthworms coming up, those types of things. Those are definite benefits of having a lower to the ground raised bed. Not to mention, this is an easier setup. It's not as expensive. You don't have as much wood and you don't have as much soil that you have to fill it with. Number 2 is don't think that you have to do it all in one season. I've counted and I have 19 raised beds, but that definitely did not happen overnight. And I know if you're on Instagram and you see these instant gardens where people are building all these raised beds all at once, I think that's fantastic. But don't feel like you have to do that, especially if you're on a budget. This is something that we have done little by little over the last 10 years or so. Give yourself permission to add a little each year, and don't feel like that you have to have your entire garden full of raised beds. That's definitely not what I did. I started out with a few, and I did a lot of in-ground gardening. And as I saw the production in my raised beds always outperforming my ground beds little by little, I kept adding more and more raised beds over the years. So don't feel like you have to do it all at once. Number 3, do consider your bed width. My beds are between 2.5 feet and 4 feet. This one in particular is 2.5 feet. This would be the maximum I would recommend if you have your bed up against a fence. The goal is to be able to reach inside the bed very easily. And so if you're not able to get on the other side, this would be my max for that. But the other sizes also have their benefits as well. A 4-foot width would definitely be my maximum. That's because, again, you want to be able to reach easily. And I can reach easily to the inside of this 4-foot bed. I can do that on both sides. What I like about the 4-foot bed is you have a maximum space. I can get a lot of crops in this space going with that maximum of 4 feet. Another thing to consider is if you have a combination ground bed and raised bed garden like I do, I like to have, now this isn't perfect, not all of my beds are this way, but I like the 4 foot because my rows are also 4 foot. So when it comes to knowing about what kind of plant spacing I'm gonna do or crop rotation and those kinds of considerations, having these 4-foot beds are easy to be able to go back and forth from year to year between ground bed and raised bed. But as much as I like my 4-foot width, obviously this is a new raised bed, that's what I chose. There's another width that I like even better, and that would be the 3-foot width. Yes, I lose an extra foot of space, which is something I don't like to give up easily, but as you can see, I can easily reach into the center on both sides. With the 4 foot, I kind of had to stretch. So to me, I feel like this is a more comfortable width, is a 3-foot bed. But the whole point when you choose the width of your bed is not to go beyond 4 feet. That way you can reach and you don't have to step on the bed, causing compaction. Just do what fits your garden space the best and also what you're most comfortable working in. Number 4 is don't get hung up on bed length. While bed width is important, bed length is really up to your preference. In my garden, I've got as short as 4 feet just because this fit this area better, but I also have longer. This bed is 18 feet long. This bed is 20 feet long. And the only drawback to this is that if I ever want to get on the other side, obviously I'm just going to have to walk around. If you're in the middle of the bed, that can be a little bit cumbersome to have to do that. But what I like about having these long raised beds is I'm able to maximize the space of this garden space entirely. I don't have to worry about weeding in between beds, and I'm able to have so much more growing space in this area. So that's why I'm not afraid to go really long on raised beds when the space allows it. That leads me to number 5, my biggest regret in the placement of my raised beds. These were the first raised beds that I put in this garden space, and I wasn't thinking about the pathways in between the raised beds and how convenient or inconvenient that might be. I cannot get a wheelbarrow in between these raised beds, and even working in the raised beds can be a little bit hard because I'm bumping up against the one behind me. So I would recommend if you're doing more than one raised bed and you're putting them together, really consider how much space that you need to have comfortably between the raised beds. Be careful not to get too far apart because that's just more that you'll have to either cover with fabric or mow or weed eat or something like that. So whenever you're placing your raised beds, make sure you're comfortable with the width in between. This is a much more comfortable width, and I can get my wheelbarrow back and forth, and this makes managing these beds so much easier. Number 6, and this may be the most controversial, and that is don't be afraid to consider the use of modern pressure treated lumber. Now, while I love my Birdie's raised beds, and if I had my option, my whole garden would be filled with them, the truth is I do use wooden raised beds for various purposes. And if you do research, you'll find people cautioning you on the use of raised bed wood that has been pressure treated. Now, prior to 2003, there was arsenic in that process, but there hasn't been that in many, many years. And from the research I have done, I'm comfortable using the modern pressure treated lumber. It's used with copper, and most likely if you had any major leaching of copper, you would see it in your plants before it was actually an issue with the crops that you're consuming. Again, that's my personal preference, and that's my personal opinion based on the research that I've done. I highly recommend you research yourself and make the decision that you're most comfortable with. It's also worth noting that pressure treated lumber cannot be used in certified organic gardening, so that's something I do want to make sure you're aware of. But for me, I choose pressure treated lumber because for the cost difference in the lumber that we have available locally, there's no comparison between pressure treated lumber and rot resistant lumber. The price is just so much greater. And now that the cost of lumber has come down since we saw it skyrocket in 2020, it's an option that a lot of gardeners on a budget might want to consider. I have to admit though, while budget friendly pressure treated wood does not come without its cost, and one of them is that pressure treated lumber can start to warp. And that's something that I really haven't enjoyed over the years, but it's a trade-off that I was willing to make. I think when you decide what kind of lumber to build your raised beds with, it will come down to personal preference. What do you feel most comfortable with? What kind of aesthetic are you looking for in your garden? You may like the look of that beautiful rot-resistant cedar, and you may have the budget to be able to afford it. Personally, why I opt for treated lumber is because I can build more raised beds for the buck. As you can see, I have 19 of them, and I believe all of them except for 5 are made out of lumber. And so you can imagine that on that scale, the cost savings definitely add up. Number 7, when you're filling a new raised bed, fill it to the top, especially if you use other materials such as sticks and branches and shredded leaves and straw at the bottom of your raised bed to try to save on soil costs. You can watch this video to see how I did that with these beds last year. It's going to settle, and the soil is going to settle a lot. That's why I recommend filling them to the top. Believe it or not, this bed was actually filled a week ago and it was overflowing. So just a week ago, you can see how much this has settled. And this isn't even a new raised bed. This is a year old. So understand that the soil is going to settle in a new raised bed. So fill it to the top and then plan on topping off your bed once or twice a year as the soil starts to settle. I do this with compost and it works out great. Number 8, when it comes to planting your raised beds, don't feel like you have to follow the between row spacing guidelines on your seed packet. When you get a seed packet or you look up what your plant spacing should be for certain plants, you want to focus on the within row plant spacing, but you don't need to worry about between the rows. The reason is because on the spacing recommendations on your seed packet, it considers that you will probably have some kind of implement or tractor or something in between rows, and you need that space between the rows. For the most part, you can ignore that and just use the in-row spacing all the way around. For example, with my onions here, onions are to be planted about 6 inches apart, but depending on where you look, they'll say to plant, 2 feet between rows. I have not found that to be necessary. As long as all of the onions I plant are 6 inches apart, then they actually do really great. Of course, it helps to have good soil and adequate irrigation, of course. Just keep in mind that the row spacing that you see is generally not considering that you're planting in a raised garden bed. With raised garden beds, you can plant closer and get more crops out of the same space. Number 9, when it comes to irrigation, do consider putting your drip lines in place before you plant. Whether you're using a regular drip line or a drip tape or these Garden in Minutes garden grids, in my experience, it's so much easier if you get them on your garden bed before you plant instead of trying to maneuver whatever you have on top of plants that are already there. I made this mistake last year when I was trying to put some drip tape on a couple of raised beds and I had to snake them through almost mature plants. It was not a fun process at all. I'm not really sure how effective it was. Not only will getting your drip irrigation in place before planting work out better as far as just ease of getting the irrigation in place, but if you choose something like the Garden in Minutes garden grid, it also helps with plant spacing. That's one thing I've enjoyed with my cabbage, with my celery. I've been able to use them as sort of a guideline for a square foot gardening method, which I really like, especially with transplants, but also with seeds. And so putting that in place before I plant is ideal. Now that doesn't mean that you can't put them on once you planted. It's just so much easier to get them in place first. And finally, number 10 is one that not all gardeners will agree with me on, but it's something that I've found works better in my garden. And that is, don't plant your perennial herbs in the same raised beds that you plan on planting annual crops from year to year. And the reason I say this is because I made this mistake as a beginning gardener. I planted my rosemary and my thyme with my tomatoes and cucumbers and all of my annual crops. And I expected for the rosemary, the thyme, the oregano to stay in that cute little small plant stage. But I didn't take into account that those herbs were gonna grow really big and they were gonna start taking over that raised bed space. What I realized then is that those crops are actually better suited for a container. That way I can contain the size of the crop, and then I don't have to lose space in my raised bed from year to year that I would have normally given to annual crops. For me, this doesn't apply to annual herbs like basil and cilantro and dill. Those I interplant all day long with my annual vegetables. That's because they will only last for a year or so. But for perennial herbs, I like to get them in a separate space. That way I have all the space I need for my annual vegetable garden. Finally, I have a bonus one for you. Do enjoy the process. With high quality soil in a raised bed, you can have more harvest with less work, less weeding, and less water with less space. To me, raised bed gardening is the most enjoyable gardening that I do, and hopefully with these do's and don'ts, you can get the same satisfaction as I and so many other gardeners have gotten over the years with your raised bed garden as well. And if you are filling a new raised bed for the first time, I have a free guide, raised bed soil options for any budget that you can download. Just click on the link in the description, and also check out other raised bed videos that I have done here on this channel. Be sure and like and subscribe, and if you're a podcast listener, you can find more beginning gardener tips at the Beginner's Garden Podcast. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.